What if the legal advice you got from an AI chatbot yesterday directly contradicts what it tells you today, and you have no way of knowing which answer is right? That is not a hypothetical. I tested it. I asked Claude the same legal question 50 times and tracked every single contradiction. This is what I found. AI legal advice is now one of the most common ways people interact with large language models. Surveys suggest that tens of millions of people have used a chatbot to get some form of legal guidance. That number is growing fast. Before we talk about whether these tools are good or bad, we need to talk about whether they are consistent. Consistency is not a minor technical detail. If a doctor gave you a different diagnosis every time you described the same symptoms, you would not trust that doctor. The same logic applies here. A tool that gives you different answers to the same question is a tool you cannot fully rely on, no matter how confident each individual answer sounds. Here is how I set up the experiment. I chose 3 legal question categories: contract law, tenant rights, and employment law. For each category I wrote one carefully worded question and kept it identical across every run. I cleared the session before each prompt so there was no memory or context carryover. Then I logged the full response each time. I ran 50 total prompts spread across the 3 categories. I then read every response and coded each one along 3 dimensions: the core legal position taken, the confidence level expressed, and whether the answer recommended consulting an attorney or suggested the person could handle it themselves. Those 3 dimensions gave me a structured way to find real contradictions rather than just surface-level word differences. Before I get into the results, I want to be clear about one thing. This experiment is not designed to attack Claude or any specific AI company. Large language models are probabilistic by design. Every response is generated fresh from a probability distribution, not pulled from a fixed database. Some variation is expected. The question is how much variation, and whether that variation crosses a line that matters in practice. Let me start with the contract law results. The question I used was about verbal agreements and whether they are legally binding for services under a specific dollar threshold. Across the runs I tracked, Claude took a consistent core position about 70% of the time. But in roughly 30% of responses, the framing shifted in a way that would lead a reader to a meaningfully different conclusion about their rights. The contract law contradictions were mostly in the gray zone. Claude would sometimes say verbal agreements are generally enforceable in this context, and other times lead with the risks and limitations so heavily that the practical takeaway was the opposite. Same question, same dollar amount, same context. The emphasis flipped depending on the session. Tenant rights was the category with the most variation, and by a significant margin. The question involved security deposit rules and a specific timeline for return after a lease ends. Some responses cited a general rule confidently. Others cited exceptions first and buried the general rule. 3 responses gave a timeline that directly contradicted the timeline given in other sessions. The tenant rights contradictions are the ones that concern me most from a practical standpoint. Someone asking about their security deposit is often in a real dispute. They may be deciding whether to send a formal letter, take a landlord to small claims court, or simply let it go. If the AI tells them they have 21 days in one session and a different number in another session, that is not a minor variation. That is a tool giving you wrong information half the time. Employment law produced the result I found most surprising. The question involved whether an employer is required to provide written notice before terminating an at-will employee. This is a question where the answer depends heavily on state law, and I was intentionally vague about location to see how Claude handled the ambiguity. What I expected was that Claude would consistently ask for more location information before answering. What actually happened was that about half the sessions answered as if at-will employment meant no notice was required under any circumstances, while the other half correctly flagged that some states have specific notice requirements or contract-based exceptions. That is not a wording difference. That is 2 factually different legal frameworks. Here is what the full contradiction map looks like when you lay it out across all 3 categories. Contract law showed the least contradiction on core legal position, about 30% of runs diverged in meaningful ways. Tenant writes was the worst, with roughly 45% of runs producing a response that conflicted with the majority answer on at least one key fact. Employment law sat in the middle at around 38%, but the nature of those contradictions was the most potentially harmful. One thing I noticed across all categories is that the more confident a response sounded, the more likely it was to omit the caveats that appeared in less confident versions. The sessions where Claude hedged more and recommended consulting an attorney were often more factually complete. The sessions where Claude sounded authoritative and clear were sometimes the ones that were partially wrong. That pattern is worth pausing on. We tend to trust confident-sounding information more than hedged information. But in this dataset, confidence and accuracy did not move together. Sometimes they moved in opposite directions. That is important to know before you walk away from an AI legal session feeling certain about something. So what does this mean for you practically? First, treat AI legal answers as a starting point for research, not a final answer. If you are going to act on legal information, verify it against a primary source like your state's official statutes or a licensed attorney. The AI can help you understand the landscape but should not be the last word. Second, run the same question more than once if the stakes are real. This sounds obvious after watching this video, but most people ask once and move on. If you ask the same question 3 times and get 3 consistent answers, that is more confidence than a single session gives you. If you get 3 different answers, that is a signal to go find a human expert. Third, pay attention to whether the AI asks you clarifying questions before answering. In my experiment, the sessions that produced the most accurate employment law answers were the ones where Claude asked about the state or jurisdiction before proceeding. That behavior is a good sign. Sessions that answered confidently without gathering context were more likely to produce a generalized answer that might not apply to your situation. This experiment also raises a broader question about AI tools in high-stakes contexts. Legal information, medical information, financial information, these are areas where being wrong has real consequences for real people. The technology is powerful, but the architecture of these systems means you should always be thinking about the variation that is invisible to you on any single session. I am not arguing that AI legal tools are useless. Used correctly, they can save you time and help you ask better questions when you do talk to an attorney. The problem is that most people are not using them as a research aid. They are using them as a substitute for professional advice. This experiment shows why that gap matters. The full data from this experiment is linked in the description if you want to go through it yourself. I kept the logging methodology as transparent as possible so anyone can replicate it. If you run your own version and find different results, I would genuinely like to see them. Drop a comment below with your setup and what you found. If this kind of real experiment content is useful to you, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want honest AI testing rather than hype. Subscribe if you want more. The next video on this channel looks at whether AI tools give different risk assessments depending on how you phrase the same financial question. Same concept, different domain, and the results are just as interesting. See you there.